In a world where protocol rules everything and one wrong step can end a career, imagine a soldier trained never to break formation, never to speak unless spoken to, and never to touch a member of the public. Now imagine that same soldier throwing away years of discipline in a single moment of pure humanity. What could possibly make someone risk everything they've worked for? The answer came in the form of a 6-year-old girl with bright eyes, a colorful headscarf, and a smile that could melt the coldest heart. What happened next didn't just break royal protocol. It broke the internet, restored faith in humanity, and reminded us all that sometimes the most powerful moments happen when we choose love over rules. This is the story of how one small act of kindness created ripples that reached every corner of the globe, proving that even in our divided world, compassion still has the power to unite us all. But before we get to that magical moment, we need to understand the journey that brought both the guard and the little girl to that unforgettable encounter. Private James Mitchell had dreamed of wearing the iconic red tunic and bearskin hat since he was 7 years old. Growing up in a small town outside London, he would watch the changing of the guard ceremony on television with his grandmother every Sunday morning. She would tell him stories about his great-grandfather, who had served in the same regiment during World War II, and how being a Queen's Guard was one of the highest honors a British soldier could achieve. The path to becoming a Royal Guard was nothing like young James had imagined. The training was brutal, both physically and mentally. For months, he learned to stand perfectly still for hours, ignoring tourists who would wave, shout, or even try to touch him. He practiced the precise movements of the ceremonial drill until they became second nature. Every step had to be exactly 27 inches long. Every turn had to be executed with military precision. There was no room for error, no moment for personal expression. The psychological training was perhaps even more challenging. Guards were taught to become like living statues, to disconnect from the world around them, while remaining completely alert to any potential threats. They learned to ignore discomfort, whether from the heavy uniform in summer heat or the bone-chilling cold of London winters. Most importantly, they were trained never to break character, never to respond to the public, and never, under any circumstances, to abandon their post without proper relief. James excelled in his training. His instructors noted his exceptional discipline and his ability to maintain focus even under the most trying circumstances. During one particularly memorable exercise, a training officer spent an entire hour trying to make James laugh, flinch, or even blink excessively. James remained as still as a statue, earning the respect of his peers and superiors. When James finally earned his place among the Queen's Guard at Windsor Castle, he felt the weight of centuries of tradition on his shoulders. The red tunic he wore was the same style that guards had worn for over 350 years. The bearskin hat on his head represented not just military pageantry, but a connection to British history and heritage that went back generations. His first few months on duty were everything he had expected. Tourists would gather around the castle gates, cameras clicking constantly. Children would try to make him smile. Adults would pose next to him for photos, sometimes getting uncomfortably close. Through it all, James remained the perfect guard, silent, stoic, and immovable. The schedule was demanding. Guards worked in 2-hour shifts, standing at their posts regardless of weather conditions. During busy tourist seasons, the scrutiny was intense. Every movement was watched, photographed, and sometimes criticized. James learned to find a zen-like state during his duties, letting his mind wander while his body remained at attention. What the public didn't see were the human moments that happened between shifts. Guards would quietly check on each other, sharing jokes and stories in the brief moments when they were out of public view. They formed strong bonds, knowing that each of them understood the unique pressures of their role. James developed close friendships with his fellow guards, men and women who shared his dedication to excellence and tradition. As months turned into his first year of service, James had seen almost everything. He had stood guard during state visits, weathered violent thunderstorms, and maintained his composure when protesters gathered outside the castle gates. He had learned to read the crowd, to spot potential troublemakers before they became problems, and to communicate with his fellow guards through subtle signals invisible to the watching public. The royal family themselves occasionally passed by during his duties. These moments were always electric, filled with protocol and careful attention to detail. James had been trained on exactly how to behave in the presence of royalty, when to salute, when to remain at attention, and when to follow specific procedures. These encounters reinforced his sense of pride and purpose in his role. But despite all his training and experience, nothing had prepared James for what would happen on a seemingly ordinary Tuesday morning in March. The weather was typical for early spring in England, cool and cloudy with a light breeze that carried the scent of blooming flowers from the castle gardens. Tourists were already gathering for the morning ceremony, and James took his position at the main gate, with the familiar weight of duty settling on his shoulders. As he stood at attention, watching the crowd gather, James noticed a family approaching. They moved differently from the typical tourists, more slowly, more carefully. The parents walked close together, and between them was a small figure that immediately caught his attention. Even from a distance, he could see that this was no ordinary visit to the castle. The family consisted of a mother and father in their 30s, both wearing expressions of gentle sadness mixed with determination. Between them walked a little girl who couldn't have been more than 6 years old. She wore a bright purple coat that seemed too big for her tiny frame, and on her head was a colorful headscarf decorated with cartoon princesses, a clear sign that she had lost her hair to cancer treatment. What struck James most powerfully was not the girl's obvious illness, but her incredible spirit. Despite whatever battles she was fighting, she walked with purpose toward the castle gates. Her eyes were bright and curious, taking in every detail of the grand building before her. She pointed excitedly at the guards, the flags, and the ornate architecture, her enthusiasm infectious to everyone around her. The parents moved with the careful attention of people who had learned to treasure every moment. The father carried a small backpack that likely contained medications and emergency supplies. The mother held a camera, determined to capture every second of what was clearly a very special trip. Their love for their daughter was visible in every gesture, every protective glance, every encouraging smile. As the family drew closer to James's position, he found himself breaking one of his most fundamental rules. He began to pay attention to individual visitors. Usually, the crowd was just a blur of faces and cameras, background noise to his primary duties. But something about this little girl demanded his focus. Perhaps it was the way she looked at the world with such wonder despite her circumstances, or maybe it was the recognition of courage in someone so young. The girl stopped directly in front of James's position, her small hand reaching up to hold her mother's fingers. She tilted her head back to look up at him, her eyes wide with amazement. For a moment, James forgot about protocol, forgot about his training, forgot about everything except the pure innocence and hope shining in that little face. She whispered something to her mother, who smiled and whispered back. Then, the girl did something that changed everything. She waved at James. It wasn't the casual wave of a typical tourist trying to get a reaction. This was the earnest, hopeful wave of a child who believed in magic and kindness, who saw not just a guard in a uniform, but a real person who might wave back. James felt something shift inside him, a moment of recognition that would alter the course of not just his day, but his understanding of what it meant to serve others. The training that had been drilled into him for months suddenly seemed less important than the simple human connection being offered by this brave little girl. In that instant, he faced a choice that would define him far beyond his military service. The seconds stretched out like hours as James stood frozen between duty and humanity, between the rules that had shaped his career and the compassion that defined his character. What happened next would become one of the most touching moments ever captured on camera, a reminder that sometimes the most important protocols are the unwritten ones that connect us all as human beings. Standing there in the shadow of Windsor Castle, with centuries of tradition weighing on his shoulders and a little girl's hopeful eyes looking up at him, James was about to learn that the greatest acts of service sometimes require us to break the very rules we've sworn to follow. The decision came to James in an instant, as natural as breathing. Looking down at the little girl's upturned face, he saw something that transcended military protocol and royal tradition. Here was a child who was fighting the battle of her life, who had traveled to see the guards at Windsor Castle, and who was offering him the simple gift of her wave and her smile. Without breaking his stance or moving his feet, James did something he had never done before while on duty. He looked directly at the little girl and gave her the smallest, most gentle nod of acknowledgement. It was barely perceptible to anyone who wasn't watching carefully, but to the girl, it was everything. Her face lit up with pure joy. She turned to her parents with excitement, pointing at James and whispering urgently. Her mother's eyes filled with tears as she realized what had happened. Her father quickly raised the camera, understanding that they were witnessing something truly special. But James wasn't finished. Something about the girl's reaction, the way her entire being seemed to glow with happiness from that simple acknowledgement, told him that this moment called for more than a small gesture. This was a child who was facing challenges that most adults couldn't imagine, and she deserved more than the minimum. Slowly, carefully, James shifted his weight slightly and lowered himself just a few inches, not enough to break military bearing, but enough to bring himself closer to the girl's eye level. The movement was so subtle that most of the crowd didn't notice, but the little girl understood immediately that he was making an effort to connect with her. The girl's parents were amazed. They had explained to their daughter that the guards probably wouldn't be able to acknowledge her because they had important jobs to do. They had prepared her for disappointment, not wanting to raise her hopes too high. Yet here was this soldier, clearly breaking protocol to make their daughter feel special. Other tourists began to notice what was happening. A small crowd gathered, but instead of the usual noise and chaos, a respectful quiet fell over the area. People seemed to sense that they were witnessing something precious and didn't want to disturb it. Cameras appeared, but they were raised quietly, respectfully. The girl, emboldened by James's response, took a small step closer. She was still several feet away, well within appropriate boundaries, but close enough to speak to him in her small voice. "Thank you," she said simply, her words carrying more weight than any military commendation James had ever received. James felt his chest tighten with emotion. In his peripheral vision, he could see his fellow guards maintaining their positions, but he sensed their awareness of what was happening. He knew that his actions were being observed not just by tourists, but by his superiors who might be watching from windows of the castle. The girl's mother approached cautiously, clearly moved by the interaction, but unsure of protocol. "I'm so sorry," she said quietly to James. "We didn't mean to disturb you. It's just that she's been so excited to meet the Queen's Guard." James couldn't respond verbally without completely breaking protocol, but he managed another small nod, this time directed at the mother. It was his way of saying that no apology was necessary, that he understood the significance of this visit for their family. The father had been recording the entire interaction, and through the camera lens, he could see something remarkable happening. Other guards, while maintaining their positions, were subtly adjusting their stances to get a better view of the scene unfolding. Even these trained professionals, accustomed to maintaining emotional distance, were being moved by the interaction between their colleague and the little girl. A tourist standing nearby, an elderly woman with a British accent, whispered to her companion, "In all my years visiting the palace, I've never seen anything like this. That guard is risking his position for that little one." The girl, perhaps sensing that this special moment couldn't last forever, reached into her pocket and pulled out something small. It was a handmade bracelet, the kind that children make with colorful string and beads. Without stepping any closer, she held it up toward James, her intention clear. James looked at the bracelet, then at the girl's hopeful face, then at her parents who were watching with a mixture of pride and anxiety. He knew that accepting gifts from the public was strictly forbidden. He knew that any further interaction would be pushing the boundaries of acceptable behavior far beyond their limits. But he also knew that this 6-year-old girl had probably spent hours making that bracelet, possibly during long hospital visits or treatment sessions. He could see in her eyes that giving it to him would mean the world to her. In that moment, years of military training battled against basic human compassion. The crowd held its breath. Even the birds seemed to quiet down. The only sound was the gentle rustle of leaves in the castle gardens and the soft murmur of traffic in the distance. Time seemed suspended as everyone waited to see what would happen next. James made his choice. Moving with the same precision he used for military ceremonies, he slowly extended his hand toward the girl. The movement was careful, deliberate, and unmistakably intentional. He couldn't leave his post to reach her, but he could make it clear that he wanted to accept her gift. The girl's face broke into the most radiant smile anyone there had ever seen. She took a few quick steps forward, staying well within respectful distance, and gently placed the bracelet in James's outstretched palm. Their fingers barely touched, but in that brief contact, something profound passed between them. "It's for good luck," she whispered. "My mom helped me make it." James closed his fingers around the bracelet and brought his hand back to his side, all while maintaining his military bearing. The bracelet was simple, blue and red strings woven together with small white beads, the colors of the Union Jack. It had clearly been made with great care and love. The crowd erupted in gentle applause, the kind of soft, respectful clapping that acknowledged they had witnessed something truly special. Cameras clicked furiously, but the atmosphere remained reverent rather than chaotic. The girl's mother was openly crying now, overwhelmed by the kindness that this stranger in uniform had shown her daughter. She mouthed, "Thank you," to James, who responded with the slightest inclination of his head. But the magic wasn't over yet. As the family began to step back, preparing to continue their visit to the castle, the girl turned back one more time. With the unconscious confidence that only children possess, she blew James a kiss and whispered, "I hope the queen knows how nice you are." James felt something crack inside his chest, a flood of emotion that he had been trained to suppress, but could no longer contain. This little girl, fighting her own tremendous battle, was worried about him getting in trouble with the queen. Her innocence and kindness in the face of her own struggles was almost too much to bear. As the family walked away, the girl skipping slightly despite her obvious fatigue, James stood a little straighter. The bracelet remained hidden in his palm, but its presence was a reminder that sometimes the most important duties we perform have nothing to do with our job descriptions. Other tourists approached throughout the rest of his shift, but James found himself changed by the interaction. While he maintained proper protocol with everyone else, there was a warmth in his bearing that hadn't been there before. He had been reminded that behind the uniform and the ceremony, he was still a human being, capable of touching lives in ways that military manuals could never describe. As his 2-hour shift neared its end, James began to worry about the consequences of his actions. He knew that the interaction had been filmed and photographed extensively. By the end of the day, videos and images would likely be circulating on social media. His commanding officers would inevitably see them, and he would have to account for his breach of protocol. But looking down at the small bracelet in his hand, feeling its rough texture, and seeing the careful craftsmanship of a 6-year-old's fingers, James realized that he would make the same choice again without hesitation. Some rules were worth breaking when breaking them meant showing kindness to a child who needed it. The relief guard approached for the changing of the guard, and James prepared for what might be a difficult conversation with his superiors. But he also prepared to defend his actions, knowing that what had happened transcended military protocol and touched something much more fundamental about what it means to serve others. James completed his shift and marched back to the guardroom. He could feel the weight of what had just happened settling on his shoulders alongside his military pack. The colorful bracelet remained clutched in his palm, hidden from view, but impossible to forget. With each step, he wondered what consequences awaited him. The relief had gone smoothly, with his replacement guard taking position without any mention of the incident. But James noticed the knowing look in his fellow guard's eyes. Word traveled fast among the Queen's Guard, and everyone would know about the interaction within hours. In the guardroom, James carefully removed his bearskin hat and began the process of changing out of his ceremonial uniform. Usually, this was a time for quiet conversation and gentle ribbing among the guards, but today his fellow soldiers seemed to sense his preoccupation. They went about their business with unusual quiet, occasionally glancing his way with expressions that seemed to mix respect with concern. Sergeant Williams, a 20-year veteran of the regiment, approached James as he was hanging up his red tunic. Williams was known for his strict adherence to protocol and his no-nonsense approach to discipline. James braced himself for what he assumed would be a harsh reprimand. "Mitchell," Sergeant Williams said quietly, his voice carrying none of the usual military bark. "I hear you had an interesting shift." "Yes, sir," James replied, standing at attention. "I'm prepared to explain my actions to the commanding officer." Williams studied James for a long moment, his weathered face unreadable. "That little girl," he said finally. "Cancer?" "Yes, sir. It appeared so." The sergeant nodded slowly. "I've been doing this job for 2 decades, son. I've seen guards break protocol for all sorts of stupid reasons. Pretty girls, celebrity sightings, even for money. But in 20 years, I've never seen a guard break protocol for the right reason until today." James blinked in surprise. This was not the reaction he had expected. "Don't get me wrong," Williams continued. "What you did was against regulations. By the book, you should be written up, possibly disciplined. But sometimes, Mitchell, the book doesn't account for everything." He paused, glancing around to make sure they weren't overheard. "That said, you'll still need to face the colonel. He's asked to see you in his office at 1,400 hours. The next few hours passed slowly for James. He tried to eat lunch, but found he had no appetite. He practiced what he would say to Colonel Thompson, how he would explain his actions without making excuses. He thought about the little girl and wondered how she was spending the rest of her day at Windsor Castle. Meanwhile, unbeknownst to James, the interaction was already spreading across social media. The girl's father had uploaded a video to Facebook with the caption, "Today my brave daughter met the kindest guard at Windsor Castle. This gentleman broke protocol to make a sick little girl feel special. There are still good people in this world." The video showed the entire interaction. James's gentle nod, his subtle lowering to the girl's level, the moment he accepted her handmade bracelet, and the radiant joy on the little girl's face throughout. Within hours, it had been shared thousands of times. Comments poured in from around the world, praising both the guard's compassion and the little girl's courage. By the time James reported to Colonel Thompson's office, the video had been picked up by news outlets and was beginning to appear on television broadcasts. The colonel, a stern man in his 50s with silver hair and penetrating blue eyes, was well aware of the situation. "Private Mitchell, reporting as ordered, sir," James said, standing rigidly at attention. Colonel Thompson looked up from his desk, where James could see several printed screenshots from social media posts. "At ease, Mitchell. Please, have a seat." This informal approach surprised James even more than Sergeant Williams's reaction had. He sat carefully on the edge of the chair, still maintaining perfect military posture. "I suppose you know why you're here," the colonel began. "Yes, sir. I broke protocol during my shift this morning. I interacted with a member of the public in a manner inconsistent with standing orders." Colonel Thompson leaned back in his chair, studying James carefully. "Tell me about this little girl." James took a breath and described the encounter, the family's arrival, the girl's obvious illness, her wave and her gift, and his decision to respond with kindness despite his training. He spoke clearly and honestly, taking full responsibility for his actions without making excuses. When James finished, the colonel was quiet for several moments. Finally, he turned his computer monitor around so James could see it. The screen showed the Facebook video, which now had over 100,000 views and thousands of comments from people around the world. "Have you seen this, Mitchell?" "No, sir. I've been on duty and preparing for this meeting." "Look at these comments," the colonel said, scrolling through them. People from Australia, Canada, Japan, Brazil, all talking about the kindness shown by a British guard to a sick child. This video has been shared by news outlets in over 30 countries. James watched in amazement as comment after comment praised his actions. Parents wrote about showing the video to their own children as an example of kindness. Cancer survivors shared their own stories of small gestures that had meant everything during their treatment. Veterans from other countries' militaries expressed respect for a soldier who knew when humanity was more important than protocol. "Sir, I understand that my actions were inappropriate regardless of the response," James said. "I'm prepared to accept whatever disciplinary action you deem necessary." Colonel Thompson closed the laptop and looked directly at James. "Mitchell, in my 30 years of military service, I've learned that there are times when doing the right thing and following regulations are not the same thing. What you did this morning was technically against our protocols, but it was also profoundly right." James felt a mixture of relief and confusion. "Sir, the Queen's Guard represents the best of British values," the colonel explained. "Yes, we stand for tradition, discipline, and duty. But we also stand for compassion, service to others, and basic human decency. Today, you embodied all of those values." The colonel stood and walked to his window, which offered a view of the castle grounds where tourists continued to gather. "That little girl will remember this day for the rest of her life. Her parents will tell this story for years to come. And because of social media, millions of people around the world have been reminded that kindness still exists, even in places where rules and traditions seem most important." He turned back to James. "I've been in contact with Buckingham Palace this afternoon. The Queen herself has been made aware of the incident. Rather than expressing displeasure, Her Majesty asked me to convey her approval of your actions and her hope that the little girl enjoyed her visit." James felt his eyes widen in shock. "The Queen knows about this?" "Indeed she does. And she understands, as I do, that sometimes serving the crown means serving the people in ways that go beyond standing at attention and following protocols." Colonel Thompson returned to his desk and pulled out a formal document. "This is your performance review, Mitchell. I'm adding a commendation for exceptional service and compassion in the line of duty. Your actions today reflected the highest values of the British military." James could hardly believe what he was hearing. "Thank you, sir. I don't know what to say." "There is one more thing," the colonel said with a slight smile. "The family left a note at the main office before they departed today. The little girl wanted to make sure you knew that she had a wonderful time at the castle and that she hopes you liked her bracelet. The colonel handed James a piece of paper with careful, childish handwriting. Dear Guard, thank you for being nice to me. I had the best day ever. I hope you stay safe, and that the Queen gives you lots of medals. Love, Emma. Reading the note, James felt his eyes fill with tears he didn't try to hide. This little girl, this brave soul fighting her own battle, was concerned about his safety and his recognition. The simple purity of her gratitude was overwhelming. I trust you'll want to keep that note, along with the bracelet, the colonel said gently. James nodded, carefully folding the paper and placing it in his pocket alongside the handmade bracelet that he had carried with him since the morning. As James left the colonel's office, he was intercepted by Sergeant Williams, who was trying hard to suppress a grin. So, Mitchell, I hear you're not getting court-martialed after all. No, Sergeant. Apparently not. Good, Williams said, clapping James on the shoulder. The lads and we've been watching the news coverage. You've made us all proud today. You reminded people why they respect the Queen's Guard. That evening, as James returned to his quarters, he found messages waiting for him from friends and family who had seen the video online. His grandmother, the same one who had first inspired his dream of becoming a guard, had left a voicemail that brought tears to his eyes. James, dear, I've never been more proud. Your great-grandfather would have done exactly the same thing. But perhaps the most meaningful message came from an unexpected source. The girl's father had somehow found a way to contact the regiment and had left a message specifically for James. It read, Sir, you gave my daughter the greatest gift today. You made her feel special and important during a very difficult time in her young life. We will never forget your kindness. Emma asks about you every few hours and keeps showing everyone the video of her special guard friend. Thank you for reminding us that there are still heroes in this world. As James settled down for the night, he looked at the simple bracelet on his bedside table. It was a small thing, made by small hands, but it represented something enormous. It was proof that sometimes the most important moments in our lives come not from following rules, but from recognizing when human connection matters more than protocol. He thought about Emma, hoping her treatment was going well, hoping she was sleeping peacefully, and hoping that their brief encounter had brought her even a fraction of the joy it had brought him. In breaking the rules that day, James had discovered something he hadn't learned in all his months of training. That true service isn't just about following orders, but about recognizing when compassion is the highest calling of all. Within 48 hours of the video being posted, James's simple act of kindness had become a global phenomenon. News outlets from CNN to BBC, from Al Jazeera to NHK, were covering the story of the Royal Guard who broke protocol for a little girl with cancer. The hashtag Guard with a Heart was trending worldwide, and the original video had been viewed millions of times. But the real magic was happening in the comments and responses. Parents were sharing their own stories of their children's battles with illness and the small kindnesses that had made all the difference. Cancer survivors wrote about the importance of feeling seen and valued during their darkest moments. Teachers were showing the video to their students as an example of empathy in action. A children's hospital in Manchester reached out to the regiment, asking if James might be willing to visit their patients. A charity organization dedicated to supporting families dealing with childhood cancer wanted to feature his story in their awareness campaign. News programs were requesting interviews, and several publishers had inquired about book rights. James found himself overwhelmed by the attention, but also deeply moved by the stories people were sharing. Each message and comment revealed just how much his small gesture had resonated with people around the world who were facing their own struggles or who simply needed to be reminded that kindness still existed. 3 days after the incident, James received an unexpected visitor. Sergeant Williams appeared at his quarters with news that would change everything. Mitchell, you need to get dressed in your best uniform. Full regalia. And, I mean everything perfect, every button polished, every crease sharp. What's the occasion, Sergeant? Williams tried to maintain his usual stern expression, but couldn't quite hide his excitement. You've been requested at Buckingham Palace. Today, the Queen wants to meet you personally. James felt his knees go weak. The Queen actually wants to meet me? Apparently, your little interaction has made quite an impression. Her Majesty has been following the story and has decided she wants to speak with you directly. The car will be here in an hour. The drive to Buckingham Palace was a blur for James. He had been to the palace before for various ceremonial duties, but this was different. This time, he was going not as an anonymous guard in formation, but as an individual being recognized for his actions. The private secretary who greeted him was warm and professional, explaining that the Queen had cleared time in her schedule specifically to meet with him. As they walked through the ornate corridors of the palace, James tried to calm his nerves and remember the proper protocols for meeting the monarch. When the doors to the private audience chamber opened, James saw Queen Elizabeth II standing near a large window that overlooked the palace gardens. She was smaller than he had expected, but her presence filled the room. She turned as he entered, and James executed a perfect bow. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "Private Mitchell," the Queen said, her voice carrying the warmth that those close to her knew well. "Please, come and sit with me. I have been very much looking forward to meeting you." They sat in comfortable chairs arranged by the window, and the Queen's first words surprised James with their directness. "Tell me about Emma," she said simply. James spent the next 20 minutes describing the encounter in detail. Emma's courage and joy, her parents' obvious love and worry, and the moment when he decided that protocol mattered less than human connection. The Queen listened intently, asking thoughtful questions and occasionally nodding in understanding. "You know," the Queen said when James finished his account, "in all my years on the throne, I have learned that the most important moments often happen not during grand ceremonies or state occasions, but in small, personal interactions between individuals. What you did for that little girl represents the very best of what it means to serve others." She stood and walked to her desk, returning with a small, elegantly wrapped package. "This is for you to give to Emma when you see her again." "When I see her again, Your Majesty?" The Queen smiled, and James caught a glimpse of the grandmother beneath the monarch. "Oh yes, you'll be seeing her again. The palace has arranged for Emma and her family to return to Windsor next week for a private tour. And you, Private Mitchell, will be her personal escort." James felt his eyes widen. "Your Majesty, I don't know what to say. Say that you'll continue to remember that sometimes the greatest service we can provide is simply treating others with kindness and dignity. The crown you serve represents not just tradition and power, but the values that bind us together as human beings." The audience continued for another 30 minutes, during which the Queen shared stories of her own encounters with sick children over the decades of her reign. She spoke about the letters she received from families, the courage she had witnessed, and her belief that small acts of compassion could have profound impacts. As their meeting concluded, the Queen stood and extended her hand to James. "Private Mitchell, thank you for reminding us all what true service looks like. You have honored not just your uniform, but the very best of what it means to be British." James bowed again and kissed her hand in the traditional manner, but as he looked up, he saw the Queen smiling at him with genuine affection. "Now, let's make sure Emma's return visit is everything she hopes it will be." The news of James's audience with the Queen only added to the global interest in the story. But more importantly for James, it confirmed that his instinct to choose compassion over protocol had been absolutely right. The highest authority in the land had not just approved of his actions, but had arranged to extend that kindness even further. Meanwhile, Emma and her family were experiencing their own whirlwind. The video of their visit to Windsor had brought an outpouring of support from around the world. Cards and letters arrived daily at their home, many from other children facing similar battles. A local television station had done a feature on Emma's story, focusing not just on her illness, but on her infectious optimism and kind spirit. Emma herself seemed largely unaware of the global attention her Guard friend had received. She was more excited about the colored pencils a viewer had sent her and the promise that she would see her Guard again soon. Her parents, however, were deeply moved by the response and grateful for the reminder that their daughter's battle was not being fought alone. The children's hospital where Emma received treatment reported an increase in donations and volunteer applications after her story aired. Nurses said that other young patients had been inspired by Emma's example and were asking to make bracelets for their own special friends. Dr. Sarah Williams, Emma's oncologist, was interviewed about the psychological benefits of positive experiences for children undergoing cancer treatment. "What happened between Emma and that Guard is exactly the kind of moment that can make all the difference in a child's ability to cope with illness," she explained. "When children feel special, valued, and connected to the wider world, it strengthens their resilience in ways that medicine alone cannot achieve." Back at Windsor, James found that his fellow guards treated him with a new respect. He was no longer just another soldier doing his duty. he had become a symbol of what their service could mean at its highest level. Tourists began asking specifically about the guard who helped the little girl, and his superiors noticed an increased sense of pride and purpose among all the guards. Colonel Thompson called James into his office one more time, this time to discuss the future. Mitchell, your actions have opened up some unique opportunities. Several organizations would like you to become an ambassador for their causes. There are speaking opportunities, charity events, and even the possibility of a documentary about your experience. James considered these options carefully. Sir, I appreciate the opportunities, but I don't want to lose sight of why this happened in the first place. It wasn't about getting recognition or becoming famous. It was about recognizing a moment when a child needed kindness and being willing to provide it. Colonel Thompson nodded approvingly. That's exactly the attitude I hoped you'd have. But consider this. Your story has already inspired countless acts of kindness around the world. People are volunteering at children's hospitals, donating to cancer research, and taking time to connect with children in their own communities. Your influence can extend far beyond that single moment at the castle gates. That evening, James called his grandmother to update her on everything that had happened. Her voice was filled with pride as she listened to his accounts of meeting the Queen and learning about Emma's return visit. James, dear, she said at the end of their conversation, your great-grandfather always said that a soldier's greatest victory isn't won on any battlefield. It's won in the moments when we choose to make the world a little bit better for someone else. You've won that victory, and you've inspired others to win their own. As James prepared for bed that night, he looked at Emma's bracelet and her carefully written note, both of which had become treasured possessions. Tomorrow would bring new duties, new tourists, and new opportunities to serve. But it would also bring the anticipation of seeing Emma again and having the chance to show her that their special moment had been just the beginning of something much larger. The simple interaction between a guard and a little girl had grown into a global reminder of humanity's capacity for kindness. And, for James, it had transformed his understanding of what it truly meant to serve others with honor, compassion, and courage. The week leading up to Emma's return visit passed quickly for James. The palace staff had coordinated with Windsor Castle to ensure that everything would be perfect for the little girl and her family. Special arrangements were made for a private tour that would allow Emma to see parts of the castle normally closed to the public, and James was given detailed briefings on how to serve as her personal escort. Meanwhile, the global response to their story continued to grow. A children's book publisher had commissioned an illustrated book about Emma and James's meeting, with all proceeds going to pediatric cancer research. A famous composer had written a piece of music inspired by their interaction, which was premiered by the London Symphony Orchestra to benefit children's hospitals. The simple bracelet Emma had made became an international symbol of hope and kindness. But perhaps the most meaningful development was the emergence of what people began calling the Emma effect. Children's hospitals around the world reported increases in visits from military personnel, police officers, firefighters, and other uniformed public servants who wanted to spend time with young patients. The hashtag #BeAnEmma encouraged people to perform random acts of kindness in their communities, while hashtag #BeJames inspired those in positions of authority to remember the human element of their service. On the morning of Emma's return visit, James woke earlier than usual. He spent extra time ensuring his uniform was perfect, not out of military pride this time, but because he wanted everything to be special for Emma. The Queen's gift sat carefully wrapped in his pocket, and he had prepared several surprises of his own for the little girl's visit. Emma arrived at Windsor Castle at precisely 10 a.m., accompanied by her parents and a small entourage that included her doctor, who wanted to monitor her energy levels during the visit. James was waiting at the main entrance, but this time he wasn't standing at rigid attention. Instead, he was positioned to greet the family as their personal guide. When Emma saw James, her face lit up with the same radiant joy that had captured hearts around the world. She was wearing a new headscarf, this one decorated with images of Buckingham Palace and the Queen's Guard, and she carried a small bag that James suspected contained more handmade gifts. "My guard friend," she called out, running toward him with the boundless energy that seemed to characterize her approach to life despite her illness. James knelt down to her level, abandoning all pretense of formal military bearing. "Hello, Emma. I'm so happy to see you again." Emma threw her arms around James in an enthusiastic hug that lasted several moments. James felt his eyes fill with tears as he returned the embrace, thinking about all the miles this simple gesture had traveled around the world and all the hearts it had touched. "I brought you something new," Emma whispered in his ear during the hug. "And my mom says you might have something for me too." James smiled and pulled back to look at her face. "I do indeed have something very special for you. But first, would you like me to show you around the castle? I know some secret places that most visitors never get to see." Emma's eyes widened with excitement, and the private tour began. James led the family through the state apartments, where Emma marveled at the ornate decorations and asked dozens of questions about royal life. They visited the semi-state rooms, where Emma was particularly fascinated by the Waterloo Chamber and its portraits of the leaders who had defeated Napoleon. But the real magic happened in the Queen Mary's doll's house, a perfect miniature replica of an aristocratic home complete with working lights, running water, and tiny books written by famous authors. Emma spent nearly an hour examining every detail, pointing out features to James and asking him to lift her up so she could see the upper floors more clearly. "This is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen," Emma told James as they stood before the dollhouse. "Do you think the Queen played with it when she was little?" James smiled, remembering his conversation with the Queen. "I think the Queen understands that the most wonderful things are often the smallest ones, made with love and attention to detail. Just like your bracelet." At this mention of her gift, Emma reached into her bag and pulled out another handmade creation. This time it was a small drawing of James in his red uniform, standing next to a stick figure of Emma. The drawing showed them holding hands, with a large heart drawn above their heads, and the words, "Best friends forever," written in careful childish letters. "I made this for you," Emma said, handing James the drawing. "My mom helped me spell the words right." James accepted the drawing with the same reverence he might show a precious military decoration. "Emma, this is the most beautiful picture I've ever received. I'm going to frame it and keep it forever." During lunch in a private dining room overlooking the castle gardens, James presented Emma with the Queen's gift. Inside the elegant wrapping was a small jewelry box containing a delicate silver bracelet with a single charm, a tiny crown with "From Her Majesty" engraved on the back. Emma gasped as she opened the box. "This is from the real Queen." "The real Queen," James confirmed. "She specifically asked me to give this to you. She wanted you to know how much your kindness and courage mean to her." Emma's parents were overwhelmed. Her mother wiped away tears as she helped Emma put on the bracelet, while her father shook James's hand repeatedly, unable to find words adequate to express his gratitude. But James had one more surprise. With permission from his commanding officers and the palace staff, he had arranged for Emma to participate in a mini-changing of the guard ceremony, complete with a child-sized replica uniform that had been specially made for the occasion. When Emma emerged from the dressing room wearing her own red tunic and a small bearskin hat, the resemblance to a Real Guard was remarkable. James spent the next hour teaching her the proper drill movements, how to stand at attention, and the history behind the ceremony. "Now you're an honorary Queen's Guard," James told her as they practiced marching together in the castle courtyard. "That means you have to promise to always be kind to others and to stand up for people who need help." Emma stopped marching and looked at James with serious 6-year-old gravity. "I promise," she said solemnly. "I promise to be as good a guard as you are." The visit culminated in a special ceremony in the castle's private chapel, where Colonel Thompson presented Emma with an official certificate naming her an honorary friend of the Queen's Guard. The document, signed by both the Colonel and the Queen herself, declared that Emma had demonstrated exceptional courage, kindness, and friendship, and would always be welcome at any royal residence. As the day drew to a close, Emma's energy began to flag, a reminder of the battle she was still fighting. But her spirits remained high as she said goodbye to James and the other castle staff who had made her day so special. "Will I see you again?" Emma asked James as her family prepared to leave. "I'll always be here when you need a friend," James replied. "And remember, whenever you see any Queen's Guard anywhere, they'll know who you are because you're one of us now." Emma smiled and gave James one final hug, whispering in his ear, "Thank you for being the nicest person in the whole world." As Emma's family drove away from Windsor Castle, James stood watching until their car disappeared from view. The simple interaction that had begun with a child's wave had grown into something neither of them could have imagined, a global reminder of the power of human kindness and the importance of choosing compassion over convenience. In the months that followed, James received regular updates on Emma's treatment progress. The good news was that she was responding well to therapy, and her doctors were increasingly optimistic about her prognosis. The even better news was that Emma had become something of a celebrity patient, using her platform to encourage other children facing similar battles and to raise awareness about the importance of childhood cancer research. James's own life had been transformed as well. While he continued his duties as a Queen's Guard, he also became involved with several charities supporting sick children and their families. He spoke at events around the country, sharing Emma's story and encouraging others to look for opportunities to make a difference in small but meaningful ways. The video of their original meeting continued to circulate on social media, viewed by millions of people who found inspiration in the simple reminder that individual acts of kindness could have extraordinary impact. Schools began using their story as an example of empathy and courage. Military academies incorporated it into their training programs as a lesson in the true meaning of service. But, for James, the most important outcome was the ongoing friendship with Emma and her family. They exchanged letters regularly, with Emma sending James her artwork and updates on her treatment, while James shared stories from his duties and encouraged her to keep fighting with the same courage she had shown that first day at the castle. On Emma's 7th birthday, James was granted special leave to attend her party. When he arrived in his dress uniform, carrying a carefully wrapped gift, Emma ran to greet him with the same enthusiasm she had shown during their second meeting at Windsor. "My best guard friend is here," she announced to all the party guests, who included several other children from her treatment center and their families. That day, watching Emma blow out her birthday candles while wearing the silver bracelet from the Queen, James reflected on how profoundly his life had changed since that Tuesday morning when a little girl in a purple coat had waved at him outside Windsor Castle. He had learned that true service isn't just about following orders or maintaining traditions. It's about recognizing the moments when human connection matters more than protocol. He had discovered that sometimes the smallest gestures can have the largest impact, and that kindness has a way of multiplying far beyond our ability to track or measure its influence. Most importantly, he had been reminded that in a world that often seems divided by differences, there are universal values that connect us all: love, compassion, courage, and hope. A 6-year-old girl fighting cancer and a 24-year-old guard doing his duty had proven that these values transcend all boundaries of age, circumstance, and station in life. As James watched Emma laugh with her friends at her birthday party, her bald head covered by a colorful party hat instead of a medical headscarf, he knew that their story would continue to inspire others long after both of them had moved on to new chapters in their lives. They had given the world a gift more precious than any royal treasure. They had given it a reminder that love and kindness still matter, that individual actions can change countless lives, and that sometimes the most important protocol of all is simply being human.